So thanks everyone, thanks for joining and thanks for having me here. So today I'll be talking about an open source project we have been working on under the Apache Software Foundation called Apache APISIX. So I'll be talking about how you can use APISIX to build reliable APIs and introduce you to the project. Yeah, a little bit about me. I'm a maintainer of Apache APISIX. I used to work on some CNCF projects before, and I tried to help newcomers in open source by mentoring through the GSOC program and the LFX mentorship program. All right, so let's first talk about the concept of reliability in APIs, right? So what does it mean for an API to be reliable? So if you are a service provider, you generally talk reliability in terms of SLA, service level agreements. So your software is up for 99% of the time or something like that. But that is quite a myopic view of reliability, in my opinion. We have to look into the underlying factors of what makes this APIs reliable. So initially we had the monolith. So your client applications are talking to a giant monolith, which is the entire backend. We moved from that to microservice-based architecture. So your whole upstream services is comprised of multiple microservices. Each service does one specific task, and your client applications talk to these microservices based on their need. So the problem here comes with reliability. So I talked about this myopic view of reliability. So what does reliability actually entail? So it means consistency. Your APIs should be consistent and produce reproducible results. Latency should be minimal. It should be secure, and you should have control on who's accessing your API. Downtime should be significantly less. And finally, to top all of this, you need to have monitoring setup to identify issues and track how your API is performing. So in this microservice architecture, all of these reliability concerns means that you have to configure your service to ensure that it is reliable. Configure each of your service to ensure that it is reliable, which is a giant overhead on the application developer. So they have to consider all this when they're building each of these microservices. So that's where we evolved to the next step. So we started with the monolith, we evolved to microservices, and the next step in this evolution is API gateways. So an API gateway is a software that takes all the requests from your client applications. So all the requests from your client applications are going to the API gateway. And the API gateway in turn routes these requests to your backend services, your multiple microservices. And it collects all the required data from these multiple microservices, combines into a single package, and delivers it back to the client application that requested this. And on top of that, an API gateway can provide analytics, security, and a lot of other features like monitoring. So in our example, we'll be using API gateways and how you can use it to build reliable APIs. And Apache APISIX is a free and open source API gateway under the Apache Software Foundation. So I'll be explaining all these with Apache APISIX. So APISIX is a high-performance cloud-native API gateway. It has features like load balancing, canary release, circuit breaking, authentication, and also observability features. You can learn about it at apisix.apache.org. All right, so let's look at building reliable APIs with Apache APISIX. So I'll be showing some design patterns. You can use any other API gateway or or you can build your own API gateway to achieve these design patterns. But I'll make this presentation high level and talk in terms of patterns. So let's start with authentication and security. So user authentication is a way to secure client to API communication. So that is quite essential when we are talking about reliability. So APISIX here is acting like a middleman between your backend and your clients. So when a user sends a request to Apache APISIX, APISIX has some inbuilt authentication mechanisms like a key-based authentication or a JWT token-based authentication. It also integrates with other third-party authentication providers like OpenID and Wolf RBAC. So apart from providing a layer of authentication, you can also get the user info when the user authenticates through Apache APISIX. And you can use that user info to provide tailor-made services or access to particular services based on the user. And another security aspect is rate limiting. So your service can be overloaded intentionally or unintentionally. So something like a denial of service attack, or maybe like your traffic is generally increasing and your backend may not be equipped to handle that increase in traffic. So in such scenarios, this spike in traffic can cause your entire backend system to come crashing down. So that's where rate limiting comes in. So Apache APISIX, sitting as this middleman between your client and your services, can take the request, and if the number of requests exceeds a particular limit that you have already set, you can choose to reject it or delay it. So this will make sure that the upstream or your backend services is always able to handle those requests. Now, looking at monitoring and observability, APISIX integrates with tracers, loggers, and other metrics platforms. So it can be a single source where you can obtain all the required metrics for your application. So, for example, in tracing, APISIX can integrate with OpenTelemetry-based tracing schemes, and it can be the point which provides the tracing ID and starts the whole observability process. It can also log each of the requests, and you can continuously monitor APISIX to be aware of the status of your backend services. And then another aspect of reliability is version control and providing zero downtime. So you might be familiar with this release strategy called canary release. So in a canary release, you are trying to update one particular service in your system. So here we have a V1 version of an application of a service, and you are trying to upgrade it to version 2 without disrupting any traffic. And you also have to make sure that the version 2 of the application is fine with is working as intended. So how do you do that? So initially, APISIX will be routing all traffic to the version 1 of your application, and you will have the version 2.0 ready to be used. And then you can change the configuration of APISIX dynamically to route some traffic, that is 5% of traffic, to the new version of the API. So with this 5% of traffic, you would be able to check if there are any issues. You are receiving actual traffic from the users, but you are only routing a small percentage of the traffic. So even if something happens with your new version, a lot of users won't be affected. And once you have tested this new version with this small amount of traffic, and once you are ready to deploy it actually, you can route all traffic to the new version of the API. So APISIX can handle all these dynamically, all these configuration dynamically. It doesn't require a restart or a reboot. So APISIX can handle all this dynamically. Another aspect of reliability is circuit breaking. So circuit breaking is an effective way to ensure reliability. So if you have three different instances of a particular service running, and if one of these services is faulty, traditionally without an API gateway like APISIX, clients will keep on making requests to this faulty API, and it will hog up the network and it will cause traffic issues. And these issues can cascade into other services as well if left unresolved. So what APISIX will do is it will break the connection from this particular instance of your backend application and route traffic to the other versions of the applications. It will poll this faulty application periodically, and once it is back to a healthy state, it will start routing requests back to this API. So this will ensure that the faulty service is disconnected from the circuit, similar to how an electrical circuit breaker works. It will be isolated from the circuit, and it will ensure that the other part of the system remains unaffected. And finally, I want to talk about redirects. So API reliability does not only concern the API developer, it should also be reliable for the users of the API. So when you are updating an API, you may change the endpoint, or you may change the path, the API path. So without something in front of the API, this would mean that the users would have to change their client applications frequently. So if you are pushing frequent updates to your API, the user might need to, or the client application might need to be frequently updated, which is unreliable for the user. So an API gateway like Apache APISIX sits in between the new API and the clients. So even if the clients are using an old API, APISIX can redirect it to this new API endpoint. And it can also do other things, like it can also send a redirect status code and mention a deprecation notice, so that the client applications, or the people who are building the client applications know about this deprecation, and they will have time to update to a new API endpoint. So this will ensure reliability for the users of the API as well. Finally, before I go, I want to talk about the open source aspects of this project. So as I mentioned, the project is under the Apache Software Foundation. And in the Apache Software Foundation, we have something called the Apache Way. So Apache Software Foundation is one of the oldest open source foundations out there. And the whole concept of the Apache Way boils down to one thing, which is community over code. So open source projects, I always say, like, open source projects are a byproduct of its community, and community is quite important. And Apache APISIX was built entirely by the community. So we have 11.4 thousand stars on GitHub, and it is one of the top level Apache projects. And this whole thing is entirely driven by community members from around the world. So community members decide on what features to build, how to fix issues, what the roadmap of the project should be. And we have people from all around the world. So a lot of people are from China, USA, and India. So that is pretty cool. And we have a lot of numbers too. So it's really good. And I also think there might be a lot of students or new developers here. So definitely contribute to Apache APISIX. Contributions of any kind are welcome. So you can contribute code, and we have something called plugin runners, which is written on every possible programming languages. So if you know any language, you can work on APISIX. Also, we are participating in open source programs like Google Summer of Code and Google's Season of Docs. So even if you are a technical writer, or you can participate in this project. So definitely check out api6.apache.org/contribute if you are interested in contributing. So I think I have five more minutes left. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. You can learn more at api6.apache.org. There is a written form of this talk at navendu.me/reliable APIs, and you can find me online here. Thank you. So any questions?
Hi, Rajiv here. I just want to find out, you mentioned that there's a fair amount of integration with monitoring and other systems. So you mentioned on the tracing side, you integrate with OpenTelemetry. What about on the monitoring and logging side of things? What are the various platforms you have existing integrations with?
So like OpenTelemetry is also for like monitoring, right? And we also have a lot of plugins. Let me show this to you. So everything in API6 is pluggable. So if you want to integrate something new, you can write a plugin for it. So if you go to api6.apache.org and you look at the plugins under observability. So with tracing, we integrate with Zipkin, Apache Skywalking, and OpenTelemetry. For metrics, we have Prometheus. And there is something called node status, which is like inbuilt on API6, and other third-party platform called Datadog. And for loggers, we integrate with a lot of loggers, including things like Kafka Logger, ClickHouse Logger, and like also with other platforms like Splunk and Google Cloud.
Okay.
So yeah.
Thanks.
How is it different from Nginx? Like Nginx itself can handle both the whole things, Apache as well as web server as well as these parts. How is it like? Why? What is the rationale?
Yeah. So Apache APISIX is built on top of Nginx. So there is a platform called OpenResty, which allows more configuration on top of Nginx. It is like a modern Nginx. So Apache APISIX is built on top of that. So it does stuff like dynamic. It does things dynamically. It has a hot reload, and it also has a lot of features that are on top of Nginx, and it is also extensible. So if you are using Nginx and if you want to have more features, then you would use something like APISIX, which is also much faster and much more performant than Nginx. So it can handle everything that Nginx does, but a lot more. So even if you are using Nginx native variables or like doing Nginx native stuff, it is also supported in APISIX. Does that make sense? Yeah. Actually, we have a page that describes APISIX versus Nginx. So
when you say this is run by the community, you belong to this organization, right? API7.
yeah.
So how does that? I mean, are there other organizations also?
Yeah. So I work for a company called API7.ai. So the names are similar. So we are trying to build something on top of Apache APISIX. So it is a for-profit company. We are obviously trying to make money, and we want to make it sustainable. But APISIX is completely open source, and it has members from a lot of other companies like Alibaba, Baidu, Red Hat, and like some other big companies like Google and Microsoft. So more people are contributing to it.
How was the project started?
So it was started by the API7.ai founders. So they initially started this project in China, and China has a completely different software economy there. So this project was originally started in China, and they had a lot of Chinese users and Chinese contributors from a lot of Chinese companies, right? And eventually it evolved to outside China, and Eventually it was donated to the Apache Software Foundation, and from there it took traction, and now it's a lot more global project, but most users are still in China, so we are trying to like spread it across the world.
And is the primary contribution still happening from API 7 or?
Yes, because like still most people at our company are employed to work on Apache APISIX. So yeah, like most contributions are from our employees. But they still follow the Apache process. So like if you want to be a maintainer of the project, you have to go through the whole Apache process, and like you have to be elected, you have to be nominated by the project's committee, which contains members from outside API 7 as well. So
You have an election for the maintainer?
yeah, like it is a process. So you have to use the mailing list to like vote for a particular person, and like you have to share his merits and all of that stuff. Yeah. Yes, there's one more question, I guess. Can I take the last question?
So,
How do we differentiate with the like market vendors? Like there are other API gateways.
Yeah.
Right? Like Amazon is there.
Yeah.
There are Utica is there, right? So how do we differentiate from those vendors?
So yeah, like compared to them, APISIX is completely open source and it is completely extensible. And when you're using something tied to a big cloud provider, you are tied to it. You have tied your entire software to that particular cloud provider. So APISIX lets you get away from that. So even if you are using multi-cloud solutions, even if you are using hybrid cloud, APISIX will support you there. So yeah. So yeah, thanks again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
sure.